As you probably know if you've followed this channel for a while, I'm a big fan of Brendan O'Neill. He's one of the strongest advocates for free speech on the public stage today. And I can't believe I missed this gem of a performance at a Battle of Ideas debate from late last year. The title of the debate was, Are Millennials Revolting? And O'Neill just completely demolishes the politics of millennials in the face of a lot of pissed off millennials in the audience and some on the debate panel as well. He pulls absolutely no punches and reminds us all what public debate used to be like and what it should be like when all the politically correct garbage is stripped away. So enjoy Brendan O'Neill.
Yeah, if you want to see how unrevolting or unradical millennials are, you just have to look at the EU referendum and the fact that a lot of them supported the EU. So what you had here was, and not only did they support the EU, not only did they vote for this corrupt, undemocratic, ossified, ridiculous institution, they also wept in the streets when it was defeated by the working classes, who they have no connection with whatsoever, most of them. So what you have is a situation where a lot of millennials, particularly the political ones, particularly the more active student ones, were on the streets fighting for, in defence of, this kind of staid, undemocratic, illiberal institution which is supported by 95% of business leaders, which is supported by the IMF, which is supported by Richard Branson, which is supported by John Major, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, Alistair Darling. I mean, every single member of the establishment, effectively. When you find yourself on the same side as those people, you know that you are not in revolt. You know you are not in revolt. There's no question about it. They were foot soldiers of the establishment. They were slaves to the status quo. And it was like, they play at being revolting, they play at being radical, but then they come home for their dinner. When push comes to shove, when the establishment is under attack, they come home, tail between their legs, they kind of brush their hair, do a side parting so their mum doesn't shout at them, and they vote for the personification of the establishment in the 21st century, which is the European Union. So no, that tells you they are not revolting. There's no question about that. My beef with the millennials, and I realise I'm saying this as an old man from Generation X, my beef with the millennials is that to the extent that they are revolting, they're revolting against the good things about their parents' generation and their grandparents' generation, and they're accepting all the bad things. That's my real problem with them. So the good things that they are revolting against is firstly the idea of racial equality. We heard earlier about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. Do not compare yourself to these people, please, because the whole point of Martin Luther King's outlook on life is that people should be judged by their character, not their colour. Millennials do the precise opposite of that. They encourage racial thinking. They are obsessed with race. They think you should interact with people depending on what colour they are, what sex they are, what gender they are, what sexuality they are. You must constantly watch your language depending on the race or gender of the person you're dealing with. It encourages divisiveness and racial thinking rather than the kind of thing that their grandparents or their parents might have argued for, which is that character is what counts, not skin colour. The other good thing that they revolt against is sexual liberation. One of the good things that came out of the 60s was the idea that sex could be fun, particularly for women, who for years and years have been told that they shouldn't enjoy sex because it was just something that men enjoyed, not women. And the idea of radical feminists in the 60s and 70s was that actually sex was a laugh, it was good fun, and you should be able to do it whenever you want with whoever you want. The millennials are completely revolting against that. You can see this in their sexual consent classes, which are ridiculous, and also their whole argument against drunken sex, for example, or regretted sex, or bad sex, all these things which they are increasingly redefining as rape, because they, A, don't understand what rape is, and B, don't understand what sex is, so they're kind of very confused on that. And then the third good thing that they're arguing against is freedom of speech. The one good thing that the 60s generation and the 70s generation did was argue for freedom of speech, particularly in the countercultural arena, the idea that you should be able to publish literature and art and films and all those things, however offensive they were, that you should be allowed to do that stuff. They were very much in favour of freedom of speech. Today's millennials are not. Anything which they deem offensive or harmful or shocking, they will no platform, they will ban, they will rail against, whether it's Robin Thicke's song Blurred Lines, which has been banned on 30 university campuses, reminds me of when I was at convent school and the nuns used to turn off the radio when Madonna came on. I mean, that's exactly the same situation. Or they banned the Sun newspaper because it used to have naked women in it, and all these ridiculous, prudish, Mary Whitehouse-style things. So they revolt against those good things, racial equality, sexual liberation, freedom of movement, and they accept all the bad things about their parents' generation, completely uncritically. Like, for example, environmentalism, the most deadbeat, depressing, anti-human ideology you could ever imagine. They love that. They embrace that nonsense. And they also embrace the therapy culture. One of the worst things about the 60s, which is why I'm so glad I was born after the 60s, is that they were all into therapy. They were all into talking about themselves endlessly on couches. They completely buy into that therapy culture. They completely buy into the idea that human beings are fundamentally fragile and they need this kind of scaffolding of therapy around their lives in order to help them get through every day, effectively. And just on that, finally on that point, what I really think that therapy question reveals is that they're not revolting at all. They're actually conforming to what their parents and their grandparents' generation expected, which is that you should constantly demand not freedom, but recognition. Not liberation, but validation. You must constantly ask officialdom and others to validate your identity, to validate your sense of mental ill health, to validate your victimhood. They are actually conforming brilliantly to the script written for them by that older generation in relation to the idea that people are fundamentally fragile and need constant help. In fact, I can't think of any other generation in living memory which has conformed so spectacularly to the older generation's expectations that they will be weak and pathetic. On the question, this idea of oppressed groups, I really agree that there is this real desire to be oppressed now. When I speak on campuses, I meet these young, middle-class, white women with these extremely plummy voices. They grew up in the home counties, some were privately educated, and they tell me that they are structurally oppressed. I mean, and they're taking the piss. They are actually taking the piss. It's completely and utterly untrue. What they mean is that someone once said something rude to them on Twitter. That's what they mean. And what you have is this real cultivation of a sense of oppression that actually doesn't exist in the real world. And I think this idea that 1 in 4 women are sexually assaulted is a perfect example of that. The reason that the NUS can spout utterly fake statistics like that is because they have redefined. Yeah, but you spout it. They have redefined the definition of sexual assault to include everything from being raped, which we all agree is a deeply serious crime of violence, to an unwanted sexual advance, right? Which means someone coming up to you in a pub and saying, "I fancy you, do you want a drink?" So their mixing together of all these different elements of human experience, firstly, undermines rape by putting it on a spectrum with normal behaviour, and secondly, gives this impression that women are oppressed in a way that is just not true. And it really actually undermines any discussion of class and real inequalities in society. The perfect example for me was when the feminist Caroline Criado Perez, who's this Guardian-style feminist, and I was on the radio with her once, and she said I suffered from male privilege or something like this. And when I was 16 years old, I was a Saturday boy in the vast supermarket chain owned by her father. And you think to yourself, this is where we've got to, a situation where someone can present themselves as the victim in response to someone whose wage labour used to fund their ponies and everything else when they were children. So it's bizarre, utterly bizarre. Just a quick thing on, firstly on Brexit. Brexit, in my mind, is the most positive thing to have happened in British politics in a generation. And I don't think all millennials were on the side of Remain. Of course not. I'll tell you who were. Mostly the middle-class ones and the well-educated ones, because the split on Brexit and Remain is largely a class one and an education one. The working classes and the less well-off and those who did not go to university voted Brexit because they still have a rebellious spirit. Those who have been socialised into the whole university way of thinking and that kind of self-victimisation and self-infantilisation and this belief that they need to be looked after by technocrats their whole life, voted for the EU. So the split is not generational at all. The split is largely a class one and a geographical one. So I think that's very important. I'm on the side of the working classes in relation to Brexit, I can tell you that much. Finally, I agree that this is actually not a generational issue. And a lot of the problems that the millennials express in terms of illiberalism and so on, it actually stems from earlier generations and their abandonment of the ideas of liberty and enlightenment and so on. And I think that's a very important point, that it is actually a political problem which millennials express in a very crude way, some of them, not all of them, but it stems from earlier generations and their failure over a period of time to stand up for the ideas of freedom of speech and liberty and enlightenment and equality.
Briefly, Brendan, just on the matter of inequality of privilege, surely millennials have a right to complain over wealth inequality. The Resolution Foundation, David Willits, found that in the 60s, rent was 10% of income, it's now 25%. Cost of renting has increased 4.5 times. These guys' generation will pay £44,000 more in rent than your generation did in their 20s. Surely they have grounds for complaint over that particular issue.
No, not at all. It's
Why not?
complete and utter
not
nonsense.
illiberal?
You know, they can do it if they want, but then everyone else can tell them they're talking absolute nonsense. This idea that the baby boomers had this wonderful life, and they all bought houses when they were 25, and they all went to university for free, and they didn't go to university. 7% of baby boomers went to university. They lived in absolute shitholes with outside toilets. These guys don't know what an outside toilet is. And if you look at that generation, if you look at that generation between 1946 and 1964, the people who were born in that generation, the vast majority of them grew up in squalor or in hardship. A tiny minority went to university and had a pretty nice time. Now, the millennials who are most vocal, the ones who are in the media and in politics, they are the offspring of that tiny minority of baby boomers who had a really nice time. So they think all baby boomers had a really nice time. I can assure you they did not. My parents are baby boomers. They came to London in 1970 from Ireland, and they did not go to university. They left school at 14. They had rubbish jobs. They had a really hard life. I think it's utterly unacceptable for either my generation, Generation X, or the millennials to look at the baby boomers and accuse them all of having privileged lives and to defame them in this way. It's simply untrue. Baby boomers had it infinitely harder than millennials. There's no question about that.
Thanks, Brendan. Brendan, is it possible for someone to imagine what it could possibly be like to be someone less privileged than themselves?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's humanism, the ability to empathise and offer solidarity to people who you may not have had the same experience as, but you understand the predicament they come from and you want to work with them in order to change things. I think that's what humanism has, humanist politics has traditionally been about, whereas what we have now is this very divisive anti-humanist politics which says, well, you can't say this because you don't have the right skin colour. You can't say this because you don't have the right genitals. It's completely bizarre and actually borderline racist, definitely reactionary. It's a very bad form of politics. I think, Richard, you really need to stop playing the working class card because it doesn't matter where you come from. You work for an institution that is explicitly anti-working class. And we've heard from the guy in the audience in relation to the things that it bans. It bans lads magazines, it bans tabloids like The Sun and The Express. I'm talking about student union offsprings. It bans certain forms of speech. It bans lad banter. The NUS has policies on actual lad banter. I mean, this is surreal. It bans the making of sexual noises on some campuses. Let's not beat around the bush. We know who this is aimed at. This is not aimed at polite middle-class young men who were brought up in the home counties, right? It's aimed at people who maybe came from your council estate, but you've kind of become some kind of bizarre turncoat or something. So you need to, what we're talking about is the institution that you work for. We're not talking about your experience. We don't really mind about your experience very much. We're talking about the institution and the politics. And this comes back to the discussion about millennials and what the visible expression of millennialism is, which is not a generational thing at all. It's a class thing. This is a very particular section of society which has particular views and which foists them onto society as representative of a whole generation, and it's not. Let me just give you one example. All you ever hear from millennial women who write in the media or who are active in student politics about sex is that sex is dangerous. Drunken sex is bad. Sex on drugs is bad. It could be rape. You should probably avoid it, and you should, talk to some therapist if you ever have bad sex that you don't like. I cannot tell you how utterly different that is from the young women I grew up with, who go to Spain, who go to Spain for 2 weeks and have sex with 27 men, completely off their nut on booze, and they don't think they've been raped. They don't think it was a harmful experience. They think it was a fun experience. Now, if you say that to millennial women who are in the media, they will say, oh, but those women have got internalized misogyny. In other words, they're brainwashed. They don't know their own minds. They don't know what's in their own self-interest. This deeply disturbing and patronizing argument. This is a class issue, fundamentally. It's a cultural issue. People have different ways of life and different opinions, and millennials do not represent that. The final point I want to make is the worst argument that is pushed by these influential millennials, as we should refer to them, it's not all millennials, the worst argument that they push is this notion that free speech is somehow damaging to marginalised groups. This is so obnoxious. I mean, we have to treat this very seriously. Their argument is that free speech is beneficial to white privileged males because they can talk nonsense all day long. But it's really bad for black people. It's really bad for women. It's really bad for gay people. Because they are harmed by certain words and certain ideas. This is such a dangerous idea. Every marginalised group in history who has fought for a progressive cause has seen freedom of speech as their greatest ally, because it's the means through which they argue against their oppression. What these guys are setting up is like a neo-colonialist racket, where they see it as their job to protect minorities from speech and ideas. That is not progressive. That is the fundamental essence of reactionary politics.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks a lot. Briefly, we're going to quick comment for you, then we're going to have a...
Student union feminists at both Goldsmiths in London and Cambridge burnt in public the literature of the Socialist Workers' Party. So book burning is happening.
Right.
And just 3 points very quickly. I'm so sorry to hear that someone had to view a house that had a toilet outside and inside. I mean, that's really hard life. I'm very sorry to hear that. You obviously don't know what I mean by outside toilet. There was only an outside toilet, and 3 or 4 families had to share it. That's what I'm talking about. Show me where that exists, please. It doesn't. In terms of choosing between living with your parents or suffering under capitalism, are you serious? Choose capitalism every single time. Capitalism won't patronise you and make you coffee late at night, and as a consequence, you will grow up and become an adult instead of being a baby for your whole bloody life. Final point, my only problem with influential millennials, just so we know who we're talking about these lovely people here, influential millennials, not millennials, they are the enforcers of mainstream authoritarian politics. They're not revolting against it, they're enforcing it. And I think they fail to recognise how fundamentally beneficial it is to the rulers of society that young people are redefining themselves as weak and vulnerable and in need of help and in need of therapy. Who benefits from that? Not young people, the rulers of society who like their young people placid and pathetic. That's who's benefiting from your new politics.